To this little lecture for the University of Aberdeen. My name is Dr Amy Irwin. I'm an applied psychologist within the School of Psychology. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about whether politeness or rudeness are universal concepts. And by that I mean, do we all view behaviours in the same way? Or is there variation in terms of how we view and perceive the behaviours and actions of others? So just to give you a little overview of what will be coming up, we will start with an introduction to rudeness. What is it? What are the kinds of behaviours that we might experience? I'll go through a couple of theories regarding rudeness, one of which is the incivility spiral. I'll talk a little bit about the impact of rudeness, how it can impact us as individuals and within the workplace. And then we'll talk about the elements that might mean that rudeness and politeness aren't universal concepts. So I'll talk a little bit about culture and regional variation in terms of how we speak to one another. I'll talk about how we might have individual variation or how different people might view the same behaviour differently. And I'll also talk a little bit about how the situation that we find ourselves in might also influence our perception of these behaviours. And then there'll be time for some questions at the end. Just a little overview about why I became interested in this concept of universal politeness. So back in 2018, I came across a newspaper article which discussed a waiter who, with the headline being fired for being French. And essentially, this was a waiter who was working in Canada, in Vancouver specifically, and his organisation or his restaurant fired him for what they called was an aggressive tone in nature. The waiter himself stated that he hadn't been rude or aggressive and that he was simply being direct and honest, as is required by a professional personality within the hospitality industry. This particular waiter had trained and learned his skills as a waiter in France. And the article detailed how there was this disconnect between how the organisation and the managers and other staff viewed his behaviour and how the waiter viewed his own behaviour. On one side, the organisation and other staff and customers thought that this particular person was very rude and was acting in a way that was inappropriate for the context and also the country, being Canada. And yet the waiter himself felt that his behaviour was appropriate and that he was just being direct and honest, that he wasn't being rude at all. And this started me off thinking in terms of what are the kinds of factors that could influence our perception of rudeness. Why might some people think that something is rude and other people might disagree? So what do I mean when I talk about rude behaviour? So this is essentially insensitive or disrespectful behaviour that violates social or organisational norms. So what I mean by this is that we all have certain expectations of what behaviour is appropriate within a certain situation. And rudeness or incivility, which I'll discuss a little more in a moment, is behaviour that violates those expectations. So it's essentially someone acting in a way that goes outside our expectations. And this might draw attention to that behaviour, or it might upset the other people that are either the focus of that behaviour or are seeing that behaviour in a particular social or organisational setting. So essentially, norms are our ideas of what is or is not appropriate within social situations. And some of these rules are fairly obvious. For example, most people wouldn't try to play heavy metal music in a library because it goes against the norm of behaviour for that setting, which is being quiet and studious. However, there can be issues in terms of how different people might perceive those rules. And this is made even more complex if you're talking about incivility. So rudeness can be fairly direct. It tends to be targeted at someone in particular. Incivility is similarly behaviour that could be considered insensitive or disrespectful, but it has ambiguous intent, which means that the person who's experienced that behaviour doesn't mean if the instigator has actually meant to act in that way or whether it might be accidental. An example of this, for example, might be you're walking down the corridor at work, you see a colleague coming the other way, you nod and smile and say hello, and they walk past you without recognising you. Did that person simply not hear you? Did they mean to be rude? Did they mean to essentially ignore you? Or might they be concentrating on something or thinking about something which meant that they didn't even recognize that you had passed them? All of these factors can have an influence on both the behavior itself and also our perception of that behavior. So if we go back to norms and our expectations of certain behaviors, issues with this include that those norms themselves may be implicit rather than explicit, which means that newcomers to a situation might only be able to pick up what is expected or what is inappropriate behavior by watching the behaviors of others and the responses to those individuals. So we're not necessarily given a set of guidelines or a set of rules. There isn't necessarily a poster on the wall telling us how we should or should not behave. We have to pick up the cues from other people, and by watching and learning and seeing which behaviors prompt a negative response, which behaviors might lead to a positive response, such as smiling, we can start to figure out what the norms are within a situation, and that will have an influence on our behavior. There's also individual variability. So some people are more sensitive than others to a perceived slight. So some people might, for example, react very poorly to something that is relatively ambiguous. If you go back to the original example of someone ignoring someone else, some individuals might perceive that as harmful behavior, which they're upset by. Others might think that that individual is probably wrapped up in their own thoughts and might just dismiss it as unimportant. There are also cultural differences, which I'll go into in a little more detail in a moment. These are often based on language differences. So the way in which we use language and the degree to which we can or should be direct in different circumstances tends to vary across national cultures, and this then might influence our perception depending on what our own national culture is. And finally, there's the impact of the situation in which we find ourselves. This can be both social, so we're influenced by the people around us. It can also be based on the location itself. So, for example, behaviours that are considered appropriate in a library might be inappropriate in a restaurant or a club, and vice versa. So if we go through, just to give you an idea of some of the behaviours that might be classified as rude, some of these are context specific, some of these might go across contexts. So a well-reported example of rudeness in a restaurant is clicking your fingers to get the attention of a waiter. That's pretty much generally considered to be universally rude. There's pointing your finger at someone. So this is just highlighting that rudeness can be both verbal or non-verbal. So clicking your fingers, pointing at someone is non-verbal, but can be considered rude by others. There might also be snubbing or ignoring someone who's trying to talk to you. You might make that very obvious by turning your back on them, or this might be a more subtle and ambiguous behaviour where, as I said, we've got someone walking past someone else without recognising them, and that might be for a variety of reasons. There are also other aspects of rudeness, such as being very abrupt, swearing at someone, yelling at someone, snubbing that person, engaging in gossip about that person. All of these different behaviours can be considered rude, and that's by no means an exhaustive list. I'm sure each of you will have your own examples of rudeness that you've experienced. In terms of how we conceptualise rudeness, one of the main theories in this area is the incivility spiral, and this was developed by Andersson and Pearson in 1999. Essentially, they have this suggestion that rudeness is, or incivility is, a behaviour that begins with the behaviour itself. So we have two or more individuals, one of which is the instigator, the other is a target of the incivility, and then you have any bystanders who might be near them within the particular situation. You have the instigator engaging in an uncivil or rude behaviour, and you have the target then reacting to that behaviour. So we have the instigator propagating the behaviour. The next stage of the incivility spiral is the degree to which the target of that behaviour, or the victim, perceives that behaviour to be rude, whether they think that behaviour is unfair or unwarranted, and whether this behaviour provokes any negative feelings. If they perceive the behaviour to have been rude or uncivil and they have a negative reaction to it, This might then generate a desire to reciprocate or a desire for revenge. And it's this idea that if someone is rude to us, we might then be more likely to engage in rude behaviours ourselves. We don't want to necessarily accept rudeness passively. We might want to actively engage with that person. Now, the degree to which we might want to do that will vary across individuals and potentially across contexts. But the idea of this spiral is that rudeness is conceptualised as a social interaction between two or more people, one of whom is instigating the behaviour, the other is experiencing it, and then you have the potential adverse impacts on any other individuals, bystanders, who might witness that behaviour. Andersson and Pearson conceptualised it as being a behaviour that is impacted by the social and geographical context within which it occurs. So essentially, they did put into their theory this idea that certain behaviours will be considered more or less rude depending on who has actually instigated that behaviour, who is around them. So, for example, is this a relatively informal social context in a pub, or is this a professional setting dealing with rudeness at work? Our perceptions of behaviours are very different across those contexts, and so the degree to which we have a negative reaction to that rudeness might also be altered. So this is a core theory within the rudeness literature, and it highlights the extent to which not only the people involved in a particular episode of incivility, but also the context and the understandings of those individuals will also have an effect on how that behaviour is perceived and whether someone reciprocates. Worst case scenario, if the person, the target, has a negative response to rudeness and wants to reciprocate, this can eventually spiral up into aggressive behaviour. So it's this idea that rudeness doesn't necessarily remain static. If we experience rudeness and we retaliate with rudeness ourselves, that person that might then become aggressive, we might respond aggressively, and so on and so forth, up to worst case scenario, an incident of violence occurring. The reason rudeness is so interesting to applied psychologists and human factors consultants and to me is that almost 100% of us will experience rudeness at some point in our lives. 98% will experience rudeness at some point in their career, so we're likely to experience rudeness at work. And almost 100% of us will experience it in some kind of social setting, whether that's at work or outside of work. And the important thing is that although it's considered a relatively low-level behaviour, certainly it's considered less intrusive or impactful than aggression or harassment or bullying. Experiencing rudeness can still lead to a range of physical, emotional, and cognitive consequences. Some of these include elements such as if we experience rudeness at work, we might be less willing or able to put in effort at work, so we might decrease our effort. It might have an adverse impact on our well-being and potentially our mental health. So we might worry about the rudeness that we've experienced. It might take up a lot of our thoughts. It might lower our self-esteem and make us feel badly about ourselves. We're also more likely to quit a job where we experience a lot of rudeness, and this is linked to relatively high turnover rates in very client-facing organisations such as hospitality, call centres and so on. We might withdraw socially, so we might want to try and minimise our interactions with others. And we might also suffer an increased risk of burnout, which is when we become cognitively, emotionally and physically compromised and are no longer able to engage in our job. So to what extent are politeness and rudeness universal concepts? Well, the first suggestion is that politeness is universal and should be universal. And this is linked to the theory of maintaining a public image or face. Essentially, within the politeness literature, there's this idea that everyone has a public image of themselves that they want to maintain. This is essentially ensuring that other people within a social or organizational setting think well of us. So we want to try and avoid embarrassment. We want to try and avoid negative interactions with others and conflicts, and we want to encourage positive perception of ourselves. And this maintenance of face is considered to be universal. So everybody wants others to think well of them. Underlying this is the idea that this should then produce a relatively universal desire for politeness. So if we want others to treat us with respect and we want to maintain our own positive self-identity, then we want to interact with others in a way that encompasses being tactful, having empathy for the other person, and adhering to civility norms so that we act in a way that other people consider to be acceptable, and that minimizes the risk of conflict and so encourages this positive perception. So this suggestion or this theory is that politeness and rudeness should then be considered universal. Everyone should want to be polite and everyone should want to avoid rudeness. However, there are alternate suggestions that indicate that politeness and concepts of rudeness will differ on a cultural level and not only nationally, but also on a regional level. This theory is based on the idea that there are key language differences between different cultures. A lot of this revolves around the idea of direct versus indirect speech. This is the extent to which we feel able to ask someone directly for something, whether that's help, assistance, or we want them to complete a particular task. In Japanese, or in the Japanese culture, phrasing a request for assistance indirectly is considered the most polite way of asking for help. So a Japanese individual might say, "Could I possibly bother you for a moment?" as a prelude to asking for help or asking that individual to engage in a task. And that's considered the most polite way of going about things. And if they asked for something directly, that would be considered the height of rudeness in Japanese culture. Alternatively, German speakers and the way in which the German language is formed is much more direct. And so a German individual approaching someone else and they want to talk to them or ask them for help will simply say directly what exactly it is that they want to do. So we need to talk, or I need you to do this task, and so on. And not only is that language phrased more directly, that's actually considered the more polite way of interacting with another individual. They find hedging or indirect speech in the Japanese manner to be impolite in and of itself, in that it takes up valuable time and might show a lack of respect for the other individual. So there are definite cultural differences in terms of how speech is formed, how direct or indirect that speech might be, and the extent to which that is viewed as polite. Some researchers have taken this even further to consider regional variation. So there's this suggestion that even when we are speaking the same language, there can still be room for misunderstanding or differing expectations about what is or is not acceptable in terms of how we phrase or address others. In this particular study, Mills and colleagues looked at regional norm variation within the UK. And they found that some regions, and one that was mentioned specifically was the Yorkshire region, and specifically the male Yorkshire individual, so Yorkshireman. They had this suggestion that within the Yorkshire community, speaking your mind, being direct, shooting from the hip, all of these other ways to describe direct speaking or plain speaking is valued within the Yorkshire culture. And that this strong regional identity leads to a very particular way of speaking. And this way of speaking is very direct. In fact, speaking indirectly, so hedging or talking around a particular issue, is considered very negatively and is often associated with a negative stereotype of individuals from the south of England as opposed to the north being Yorkshire. So in this way, we have not only national cultural variation in terms of how people should or should not address people, we also have regional variation within the same national culture. So whereas Yorkshiremen might think that speaking your mind and speaking plainly is to be valued, other individuals, for example, from London, might have the opposing view. So there's this idea that, can we even say that politeness can be universal within a particular culture if there is then this regional variation on top of that? There's also the suggestion that rudeness can be very much in the eye of the beholder. So Porath and Pearson put forward this appraisal theory. They suggest that, building on the incivility spiral that we've already briefly talked about, that an individual perceives incivility. So a target, or rather an instigator, engages in a rude behaviour. The victim then has their own appraisal of that incivility, and they judge whether they consider it to be rude, uncivil, or neutral as a kind of starting point. Their appraisal of that incivility will then lead to an emotional response. And the key emotions that Porath and Pearson identified were anger, fear, and sadness. The extent to which they had an emotional response and the type of an emotional response that it was then influenced their further appraisal of the instigator as a person, the social context in which they were operating, and the extent to which a particular behavioural response was warranted. So, for example, if a victim perceived incivility and that made them angry, they're more likely to respond aggressively. If that incivility made them feel afraid or worried, they're more likely to withdraw from the social situation. So this indicates that the individual's own appraisal of that behaviour is going to influence how it makes them feel and how they might respond to it. And linked to this is the idea that every individual might have a slightly different approach to what they consider to be rude or not rude. And this might have links to their national or regional culture. It might also have links to their mood, the level of stress that they're under, whether they're tired, and so on. So there's this idea that not only can the idea of politeness and rudeness vary culturally, it might vary across individuals, and what's more, vary within individuals depending on how they feel or their experience leading up to that particular moment. And the last element that I wanted to raise is this idea of context. So to what extent might the situation that we're in influence our perception of behaviours within that situation? In a study that I did and published recently, we looked at rudeness across different teaching contexts. So we wanted to look at rude behaviours within a single organisation, that being higher education, and then look at how different teaching contexts might influence the extent to which certain behaviours were engaged in and were not considered rude. And we looked at lectures versus tutorials. Now, lectures were considered to be the stereotypical lecture where you have 100+ students within a lecture theatre, and you have a lecturer at the front of that lecture theatre behind a lectern presenting a PowerPoint presentation or similar. Tutorials are where you have 30 or less students in a much more interactive context where they might be engaging in group work, and the tutor might be engaging both with groups or might be engaging with students one-on-one, and so on. We found that rude behaviours occurred much more frequently within lectures, and they were also considered to be much more acceptable within the lecture context. And this was linked to several aspects of the lecture context specifically. The first was density. So essentially, when an individual is in a lecture with 100 or more individuals, they feel much less identifiable. They feel that they're not going to be noticed. And so they feel much more free to engage in behaviours that might be considered rude. And these might be relatively minor behaviours, such as checking their mobile phone, texting other people, talking to their friends, ignoring the lecturer, that kind of thing. There was also a difference in terms of the descriptive norms, so the extent to which certain behaviours were considered acceptable. Behaviours such as ignoring the lecturer, talking to friends about what might have happened the night before, texting on your mobile phone, were all considered to be much more acceptable in the lecture context than they were in tutorials. And part of that was linked to the risk of negative outcome. So essentially, in a tutorial, students felt that they were much more noticeable, and they were much more likely to be told off for some of these behaviours than they were within a lecture theatre, where not only would they be less noticeable, but also the lecturer was much less likely to stop a lecture to deal with some of these behaviours in the moment. And this suggested that the context within which rudeness occurs can influence how we perceive it, so whether we consider it to be rude or acceptable, the extent to which we think that we are likely to be or receive a negative outcome for engaging in that behaviour, and the kind of impact that that behaviour might then have upon us. So the context in which it occurs can have a great effect on how we perceive and experience that rudeness. So that's come to the end of this little lecture. And essentially, we've dealt with this question of whether politeness is universal. And I've talked about how it can be influenced, or the experience of rudeness can be influenced by cultural variation, regional variation, the context in which it occurs, and also the characteristics of the individual who is appraising and perceiving that behaviour. I'll be very interested to know what some of you think. I'm open to answering questions and responding to comments. And also, if this is something that you're interested in and you want to learn more about, we do have an online course that's taken at a postgraduate level called Safety Critical Skills in Industry. And a segment of that course is devoted to conflict management and the idea of rudeness and so on.